Thank you, Hal. Good to see you tonight. I'm glad that you're here. I just want to make one announcement real quick, and that is, don't forget about building on the American Heritage Series that will start this coming Thursday evening. That's May the 23rd, and be from 7 to 8 p.m. down in the basement. And I want to encourage everyone to come and to be with us for this DVD series. It is, of course, David Barton, historian, that it will be doing the lessons, and I have seen them, and they're really, really good. And you may have seen the American Heritage Series, but this is building on that series. So I want to encourage you to come and be with us for it as well. That'll be this coming Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. Turn with me to Mark the 10th chapter. Tonight we're going to talk about, I guess, what you might call the fabric of society. Jesus, most of the time, talked of issues that were basically theological or what you would call temple or church-related things. But tonight, we're going to look at what Jesus had to say about marriage and divorce, and about how we should treat one another, the roles in marriage. And this really is about as contemporary as you could imagine, because if you go to schools, you go to East Cheatham, West Cheatham, any of our schools around here in Cheatham County, and they're no different from any of the other schools in the state of Tennessee, with the statistics that I'm going to share with you. But about 67% of all those little children are from either blended families or families where they only have one parent. And most of the time this is because not of the results of death, but the results of divorce. People are not being properly taught concerning marriage and what they need to be doing. And we're seeing this as it is eroding away at the very fabric of our society. And the families, and I'm not casting judgment, I know there are situations where blended families are perfectly fine, but there are situations where there's a lot of times, there's a lot of just divorcing and remarrying and things going on where folks are just not really paying attention to what they're doing. They don't care as far as a commitment, but they need to teach people how to make commitments and how important it is. They see in Jesus' day, the same thing to a degree was going on. Today, a lot of times ours is because of lack of commitment, whereas theirs may have been some other issues as well, as we're going to look at the Old Testament. But I want you to listen in Mark chapter 10. You know, last week we looked at hail in Mark chapter 9, but now here in Mark chapter 10, I want you to listen to what Jesus is going to say. Mark, now, in the first couple of verses, he is kind of setting the stage. He says, getting up, he went from there to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Wherever Jesus went, he was always teaching. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. Now, the reason that Mark includes some Pharisees is because the Pharisees, they were pretty well split about everything. You know, you had the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection, the Sadducees who didn't. But then you had the Pharisees here concerning divorcing, that they had different views, as we'll look in the Old Testament from where they get their views. And incidentally, if you want a really good, what I would call concise and pretty simplistic, Sellers Crane. You know, Sellers, who preaches and one of the elders at Rivergate. He's held several gospel meetings here. He has done, in the Truth for Today series of commentaries, the work of Matthew. And the material that I share with you is in a very simplistic form with a lot of footnotes to where you can actually find these in the Talmud and in the rabbinical writings. But now, these Pharisees came to Jesus and was questioning him whether or not it was lawful for them to divorce their wife. And we'll get into why this question arose in a minute. But let's go ahead and listen to what Jesus says. In verse 3, he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? Now, who did Jesus cite as the source? Moses. Well, what does he mean by Moses? He's talking about the law of Moses. What does the law of Moses say? We'll look over there in just a moment, because they're going to, in verse 4, say, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, and for that reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Then the house of the disciples began questioning him about this again, because you see, they wasn't really sure. They're not exactly Bible scholars, you know, they're fishermen and folks like that. And so they asked Jesus about this again. In verse 11, he tells them that whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And then look in verse 12, because he's going to throw something else into the mix that they had not ever heard. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Now, Jesus is striking at the very thing that was eroding their society, and that was the breakdown of the home. Now, the Pharisees that came to talk to Jesus about this was divided by a couple of understandings that they had concerning the Old Testament law. And if you will, go with me, I just want to read this. Go to Deuteronomy 24 for just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Remember, Jesus said, what does Moses say concerning this? Well, let's just go there and look and see what Moses said. Okay, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And I want you to notice it's very kind of concise. It's not real long out. It's not what you would call complex. He just very plainly, Deuteronomy, incidentally, is one of the 5 books of what we call the law. You know, you got Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a very special book because it is called a divine commentary on the law. In other words, God started out with the 10 Commandments. And then if you wanted to know how you would take those 10 Commandments and put them into everyday practice, you go to the book of Deuteronomy, because it expands this. And this is not what some man says. This is what God says. That's why it is called a commentary on the law. But it is not only a commentary, but it is a divine commentary. That is, the commentary comes from God. Now, in Deuteronomy 24, look at verses 1 through 5. This is what the law of Moses is going to say about divorce. It says, when a man takes a wife, and you know, this is what Jesus asked them. He says, what does he say? They said, well, he said that they can have a certificate of divorce. Okay, well, here's the full law right here. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her or uncleanness, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if later, or if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband, that is that first husband, who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin in the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. Now, when you look at the command, he says, here is this woman, and if a man finds disfavor, and notice how it is, it didn't say if the couple, but it was the man finds disfavor with the woman. The woman, she didn't have really that much to say about it. But if he finds a disfavor, and he says the disfavor now specifically is uncleanness. Actually, the Greek word in the Septuagint is the word porno, or pornea. We get the word porno, pornographic from, which talks of sexual sins. And he says now, if he finds a disfavor, an indecency in her, and he has no favor, and she has no favor in his eyes, then he can write her a certificate of divorce. Now, why then, if it's that simple, why then did they come and debate Jesus about this? Well, there are basically two groups of folks. And like I say, before we get too far into this, let me just say, the Bible does not condone, commend, or command divorce. Now, I've been preaching and been involved in the ministry for, let's see, almost 40 years now. Almost 40 years. And in that 40 years, I've done a lot of counseling with couples. I have yet ever to say, you know, what y'all need to do is just get a divorce. You know, I've never said that. I have a friend, a very dear friend, who is a Christian counselor. He has a doctorate degree in psychology, and he sees a lot of situations that I can't deal with, so I pass them on to somebody like him. And Ron has told me in his 50 years as a psychologist, he has only recommended divorce 2 times. You know, and it was very unusual situations. The Bible does not command, condone, or commend divorce in any way. Although, here in Deuteronomy 24, it is given, but he said, find something that displeases you in indecency. Well, you wonder, well, why is it then that they even asked Jesus about this? Well, let me tell you what was happening in that day. The Jews, specifically the Pharisees, were divided into 2 camps when it comes to divorce. They were divided up. There was one group of the Shammai, that is S-H-A-M-M-A-I. I think I spelled it right. But you can write that down, and you can go and you can Google them, and probably Google them and find it. This is reference work here. It's no big problem to find this. But they said that the disfavor was unfaithfulness, you know, some type of adultery. But then there was another camp that was of the Hillel, which is spelled H-I-L-L-I-E-L. And Rabbi Hillel said that, well, the disfavorment was not adultery, and what they cite is, if you go over to Deuteronomy 22, go to Deuteronomy 22, and see, this is the group that is talking to Jesus. This is the group that he's talking to right now because of the way he has answered them. And I'll show you in another place where he was talking to this group too. Look in verse 22. If a man is found lying with a married woman, what's to happen to her? Both of them shall die. The man who laid with the woman and the woman, thus you shall purge the evil from the Israel. Now in the Hillel camp, Rabbi Hillel, they said, okay, if a woman is taken or caught in adultery, she and the man are to be put to death. Is that what it says? Okay, now, this is their reason. And I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just telling you what was going on here. Their reasoning was, then Deuteronomy 24 wasn't talking about adultery. It was talking about something else. And, you know, like today, people get divorces for all kinds of reasons. If it don't work out, if I don't like him, or I've fallen out of love with her, or I've found somebody different. And it's kind of interesting, if you read Sellers Crane's commentary on Matthew, he cites a lot of the rabbinical writings. For instance, those in this Rabbi Hillel's camp, you see, there's the very people Jesus was talking to in John chapter 8. Look over with me in John chapter 8 for just a moment. You'll see that these folks, they came to Jesus, and they're going to leave something out. In John chapter 8, of course, is the story of the adulterous woman. Now, we know which camp these Pharisees that are going to talk is going to come from because of what they're going to say. But Jesus went to Mount Olives, and early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and the people were coming to him, and they sat down, and he began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act." Now they're not going to quote Deuteronomy 24, they're going to quote Deuteronomy 22. Now, the law of Moses commanded us to do what? To stone such a woman. To stone such a woman. What then do you say? And they were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds to accuse him. And of course, they didn't have the right to take anybody's life. And so they thought they had Jesus in a kind of between a rock and a hard spot. Because if he said, well, go ahead and stone her, then they can say, well, you're not being faithful to the Roman Empire because Rome won't let us stone people. But if you say don't stone her, then you're going against the law of Moses. You see, they're quoting Deuteronomy 22 to him here. And so we know which group of the Pharisees that Jesus is addressing here. And he kind of gives them something that I guess they never have even thought of. And that is, well, let's stone. How about just forgive her? Why don't you forgive her rather than stone her? Because you remember, if you read the continuation of the story, that they were saying this and testing him in verse 7 when they persisted in asking him, you know, come on, Jesus, give us an answer. You're looking at Deuteronomy 22, verse 22 like we are. What does it say? It says to stone her. Now, give us an answer. Well, Jesus, he straightens up and he says, who is among you without sin? Among you, let him cast or throw the first stone at her. And he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they began to go out one from another, beginning, well, let me back up a little bit. I've kind of skipped. But he stooped down on the ground in verse 6, and he wrote with his finger, and they persisted in verse 7. And then in verse 7, he tells them that whoever is without sin, let him throw the first stone, because you see, under the Jewish judiciary system, their court system, that if you was a witness against somebody in a capital crime, and you was a witness that they were guilty of the crime, the sin, whatever, you had to throw the first stone. So Jesus said, okay, you throw the first stone. Whoever doesn't have sin, you throw the first stone. And what happens, of course, they begin to leave, and they leave the woman alone. Now, Sellers cites a number of things. It's kind of interesting reading, and like I say, it's pretty simple. These folks had a view toward kind of objectivizing women. They saw them as objects. For instance, the rabbis commanded this one man that because he didn't like his wife, that he was to divorce her. Well, you got to understand that if you divorce a wife, you've got to give her dowry back to her. You know, in those days, a woman would have a dowry, which was kind of like an investment. And it might be $50 or it might be $50,000, just depending on how wealthy a family she came from. Well, part of the rabbinical writing said that if you divorce her, you've got to give her that dowry back. And so they were pushing this so much. These rabbis were pushing this to the point that the man said, I can't divorce her. I don't have the dowry money. I can't give her money back. And they literally took up a collection and made up the money to give to him so that he not could but had to divorce her. There's another situation in the rabbinical writings that if you look at the footnotes of Sellers' book in Matthew chapter 5, verse down in 32, 34, in that area there, which Jesus is covering this very same ground, that if this pleasure could be that you've got this wife, and you come along here and you find a woman that you think is prettier, and she's more appealing, well then you divorce her and marry this one. You see why Jesus is saying what he's saying? And how that this is so apropos for us today, that we are literally coming apart at the fabric, not the seam, but in the fabric of society when these things happen. Now, Jesus told them two things. Number one, that you just not divorcing your husband. You divorce your wife, you're going to commit adultery against her. If you marry somebody else, you're going to cause her to commit adultery. And then he says, if a woman divorces her husband and marries somebody else, she's going to commit adultery. You see, this was a new thing because women had always been looked at as property and objects. They had never been given rights until Jesus came along. And so he puts both of them in there. If you go over to Matthew chapter 19, you'll find that Jesus is going to explain, you know, if you look at these two rabbinical writings here concerning divorce, one divorce is it had to be for adultery, the other one it could be for any cause. Jesus is going to answer it. He's going to answer it. In Matthew chapter 19, you look beginning in verse 1. And we'll read the context here because, again, it's that same group that he's talking to again. And when Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee, and he came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. You'll notice that he's always in Judea where the Jews are when he's talking to them about them, because they come out of Jerusalem to discuss this with him. And a large crowd followed him, and he healed them there. And some of the Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And Jesus answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" Now, I want to make a point here. One of the things that we need to do with our young people and with everyone that we come in contact is to have them understand and to teach them understanding concerning definite roles. Concerning definite roles. Marriage is between a man and a woman. If you look, as Jesus is quoting from where? Where's he quoting from? Genesis. He's gone all the way back into the Garden of Eden. And there, whenever God brought Adam and Eve together, it was kind of a ceremony. Adam said, you know, because she was taken from my rib, I'm going to call her woman. And for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and they two shall become one flesh. And God said there that we made them male and female, and the wording is the male is to be attracted not to other males, but the male is to be attracted to the female. And the female is to be attracted not to other females, but the female is to be attracted to the male. That's why this is put in there. He created them how? Male and female. He is defining what marriage is. And it's in the setting of marriage that Jesus brings out the part about the sexes. You have male and female, but they are designed to desire one another. And so he says, now, for this reason, man shall leave his father and mother, which he's quoting Adam, and be joined with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And they said unto him, then why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And you see, that's Deuteronomy, not 22, Deuteronomy 22. Remember the Pharisee group in John 8 was quoting Deuteronomy 22, but this group is quoting Deuteronomy 24. And he says, why did he give her a certificate of divorce? And he said, because of the hardness of your heart, that Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. In other words, that was not in God's plan. God's plan was marriage is for keeps. You get married, you stay married. And then he goes on to say, in verse 9, that I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay, see, Jesus answers the issue. Jesus answers the issue. What does he mean? What did Moses mean in Deuteronomy 24 when he says that if a man's wife, if he's displeased with her because of some sin, and he explains, well, the sin he's talking about is the sin of immorality. And Jesus said, okay, it's immorality. And so he says you can put her away for that reason right there. And Jesus is teaching us the seriousness of marriage. Now, I've had this to happen a couple of times. Matter of fact, the last couple that I worked with and counseled in what we call premarital counseling. By the time we got through with the premarital counseling, both of them said, you know, we're not ready to get married. And I said, I agree with you. You're not. And they didn't get married. Now, they're not living together, but it turned out they really weren't as compatible in love as much as they thought they were. You see, this is serious. And if you take a really serious look at this, is that, you know, when you marry a husband, you need to look at what you're marrying. If you're marrying a wife, you need to look at what you're marrying. Because the Bible nowhere condones, well, if it doesn't work out. And one of the red flags that came up to me immediately was in a private session on one occasion. The girl said, well, I look at it this way. And you know, I was trying to talk to her in terms of, you know, this commitment here, are you sure he can make this commitment from what has gone on in the past? And she said, well, I look at it this way. If I get married and he later runs around on me, I'll just get a divorce. Well, that's not the spirit of marriage. That's not the spirit of marriage at all. The spirit of marriage is, this is to death do us part. And I don't want to be a part of something that somebody is not wholeheartedly going to be involved in. And the situation, well, if it don't work out, I'll just go home. Well, no, that doesn't work that way either. And we talked to our children in terms of this whenever they were going to get married, and told them, now look, you're not coming home. You're married, and you need to remember you're married, and you will work these problems out. And it's not going to be from my house. I mean, there can be extenuating circumstances. I understand that, and there are some, and I'm not blind to those, and I perfectly understand those things. But we have got to teach our young people, and we've got to remember ourselves that God takes marriage seriously. He takes marriage seriously. And I hope that you will teach your children, your grandchildren, that this is important. This is a big step in your life. And God wants it to be the best because why? This is the very fabric, the very material that society is built on. It's the home. You know how strong a nation is? It's as strong as its homes are. As strong as its homes are. And I like what Dr. Ben Carson said about the founding fathers. He said, number one, they were well-read. That is, they were educated men. They knew what was out there. Number two, they were well-bred. They came from good families. And number three, they were well-married.